I'm delighted to welcome you all here this evening to the 4th annual lecture of the International State Crime Initiative. My name is Penny Green. I'm the co-director of ISCI and a professor in the Dixon Poon School of Law. ISCI has accomplished a great deal in its first 4 years of existence. Apart from our previous annual lectures, we had Robert Fisk as our first, Noam Chomsky, John Pilger, and an additional public lecture last week by Richard Falk, who's visiting the school. We've also secured an £830,000 research grant from the ISCI to explore comparative resistance to state violence and corruption in 6 different countries, a project we are now well underway with. We've launched the world's first dedicated journal to state crime. We've created a dynamic website, www.statecrime.org, including cutting-edge stories, a state crime in the arts blog, and a wonderful e-testimony case study site. We have a state crime book series with Pluto Press, and we've developed a wonderful team of researchers, administrators, interns, and activists. Our annual lecture is the highlight of ISCI's calendar. It's an opportunity for us to welcome you, for us to talk to you about our work, and we're very grateful for your support and friendship. And I think one of the conversations that we can have when we break for refreshments is to find out just what, in fact, we have been up to. I now turn to what you've all come for, and that is our guest speaker this evening. Ahdaf Soueif is a celebrated novelist and equally celebrated political commentator. Many of you will know her novel, The Map of Love, shortlisted for the Booker Prize in 1999, and her more recent Cairo, My City, Our Revolution, which beautifully captured the routine lived experience of extraordinary times in Egypt. Her brilliant reporting from Tahrir Square during the days of the revolution filled the watching world with excitement and expectation. We lived the Egyptian revolution vicariously through her very personal but deeply analytical accounts as we celebrated with the Egyptian people the overthrow of the criminal Mubarak regime. More recently, as revolutionary hope has turned to fear, dreadful disappointment, and despair, Ahdaf has provided biting critiques of both the Muslim Brotherhood, who rose to power on the back of the revolution, and of the military, who deposed President Morsi in July of this year. Despite the violence, repression, and desolation, Ahdaf's writings serve to keep the fire of revolutionary change in Egypt alive for us. Ahdaf will speak for 45 minutes, following which there will be 25 minutes for questions from the floor and contributions, and then you are all invited to a reception in the Old Anatomy Museum. It now gives me the greatest pleasure to hand over to Ahdaf Soueif and her presentation, The Ongoing Revolution.
Thank you, Penny.
Thank you very much. And I'm just going to turn that. Sorry.
Okay, so thank you so much for being here, and thank you, Penny, for one sec. And thank you, Penny, for asking me to do this. And I accepted straight away because it seemed to me that this is, I'm really excited about this institution, and everybody that I've spoken to in Cairo about it has kind of said, ooh, about time, somebody is doing this. It's wonderful. Okay, so what as Penny said, I'm going to speak for 45 minutes, and then I'll be very happy to take questions, comments, and so on. And this is not really a lecture, and it's not really a PowerPoint presentation. So it's really more sort of notes and observations and trying to give you an idea of what is happening, sort of framed or tilted to the interest of the International State Crime Initiative. So, it's almost impossible when things are so happening and you're in the middle of them to start anything except from where you are now. So this is where I want to start with where we are now. And I've just flown in actually this afternoon from Cairo. But the basic premise, the ongoing revolution, is what this is all sort of based on. I continue to call it a revolution, even though there are people who call it an uprising or various other sort of smaller descriptions. I believe it is a revolution because it has actually changed the mindset of people, and it is ongoing. In fact, I would say that this revolution has been in the making for a number of years, and that the phase of it which kind of boiled over in January 2011 started in 2000 with the support of the People for the Palestinian Intifada. And since then, it's kind of like never gone away. There has always been protest, and it has grown, and it has spread, and then it reached a climactic point in January 2011, and then again at the end of 2011, and then again on the 30th of June of this year. So citizens insisting on a radical change, faced by an insistence on the part of the system to remain the same. The numbers of citizens will grow and shrink. The people that you will see participating in the revolution will grow and shrink. It's a kind of organic process. And their orientation might also shift, and certainly their tactics and strategies change, their mode of action changes. And the system can also change forms, and it does, but I think with less freedom than the people. So, to look at what's happening now, let's say in the last 3 days. And if we look at the last 3 days and we look at the events that have been happening in them, you'll find that, well, I've kind of classified them into 3 categories. One I've called sort of constant events, things that are happening all the time, which are confrontations, which are detentions, people being dragged off the streets, either as a result of confrontation or simply as an act of kidnapping, continuing torture in police stations and in jails, strikes by workers or in the universities. So this kind of ongoing turbulence has been constant for really now almost daily since 2004. But of course, again, with varying degrees of intensity. And then you have intermittent happenings, things that do happen repeatedly, but intermittently. So for example, in the last 3 days, we have had a train disaster. This is the 3rd train disaster that we've had in the last several months, where the signals don't work, or the signalman isn't there, and a bus doesn't stop, and so you have a crash where a whole lot of people are killed. So in varying forms, we have disasters, whether they're to do with transport, whether they're to do with buildings collapsing, but they're basically the physical manifestation of the rundownness that the country has been allowed to suffer. And also intermittently, we have a police or a state security, a police officer or a state security officer killed. Attacks on posts in, mostly in Sinai. And again, this becomes greater or lesser in different times. And then we have exceptional. So exceptional for the last 3 days, the events of Mohamed Mahmoud, the commemoration of the events of Mohamed Mahmoud, and legal activities such as the current writing of the Constitution, for example, and current attempts to push through certain laws. So if I may, I'm going to concentrate on Mohamed Mahmoud as an entry into what we're talking about, and then touch on the, the legal activities that are taking place. Okay, so now let's see if I can, okay, that's, and then what? Sorry, just go. Right. So, Mohamed Mahmoud is the name of a street that branches out from Tahrir Square in Cairo. And I don't know if any of you remember that it was one of the climactic moments of confrontation between people and regime in the military at that point and the police, but under the command of the military in 2011. Mohamed Mahmoud is a name, Mohamed Mahmoud. The street was named after actually a particularly vicious minister of the interior back in the early 20th century, and it's right here. So briefly, what happened was in, well, you will remember that 11th of February 2011, Mubarak stepped down and the military took over, and the military was headed by SCAF, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, and SCAF was the ruler for about a year. There was a constant tug with the revolution on the streets about a cabinet and who should be in the cabinet, and then what authority the cabinet should have. And there were constant confrontations, which escalated. And the escalation, the violence, was always instigated by the authority being the military. So on the 9th of October, I mean, there were various confrontations leading up to Mohamed Mahmoud, which is what we're going to talk about now. Essentially, on Friday, the 18th of November, Friday was declared the day of the single demand. And that single demand was that the military should announce a date when they would hand over power to a civilian government, and that they would commit themselves to running elections in preparation for that date. So people came out, and the day of the one demand happened, and then people on the whole left, but a group of about 100 families of people who'd been killed through the course of the preceding months of the revolution, and also people who had been injured to a degree, well, maimed, basically. So about 100 families remained, and the police came down and started to disperse them by force, and was extremely, extremely violent in dispersing them. And so the people who had been, or some of the people who had been on the protest started fighting the police and trying to protect the families. And the response, again, was extremely brutal. This went on for a day. general populace heard about it, and so people started flooding into Tahrir. Hospitals, field hospitals were set up, and it was a very violent confrontation. The reason it became known as Mohamed Mahmoud was that here, this is where most of the action happened, and it was an odd thing. Now this here, you can see this is Tahrir. Is my cursor moving up there? Can you see it? Yes, it is. Okay, good. Technology is working. So this is Mohamed Mahmoud, and down here is the ministry, this big block here is the Ministry of the Interior. And the preferred route of the police, when they moved their battalions, was to come along this way, and then up Mohamed Mahmoud Street and into Tahrir. And so what the young people were doing was that they were blocking Mohamed Mahmoud to protect Tahrir. Now, the police and the military could have gone round. There were lots of other streets. And in fact, lots of skirmishes happened elsewhere. But they insisted on taking on people in Mohamed Mahmoud. And after, it lasted 6 days, at the end of which about 50 people had been killed. It became a really iconic, like this? Right. It became an iconic event because it lasted so long, because it had so much sympathy from ordinary people, so that people were flooding in to help, because there were acts of extreme courage that happened, because there was innovation. This was when we first saw the motorcycle ambulances, for example. So you have two guys and they wedge a person in the middle and rush them off to hospital. This one's a rather cheery picture. They mostly weren't like that. And from the point of view of crime and so on, motorcycles, those are quite often actually, I mean, if you're walking normally in a street and a young man on a motorcycle scoots quite close to you, normally you're worried because your handbag can get snatched. So at other times, they can act in unlawful ways. In Mohamed Mahmoud, and subsequently every time there were confrontations, suddenly it was like a magic wand. They changed and they became the saviors of the injured and the people who were, I mean, she's probably sort of overcome with gas. And the other thing was that the police shot directly into people's eyes. So this is Ahmed Harara, who became and is very much a very loved figure of the revolution. He's a dentist, and he lost his first eye on the 28th of January, and he continued to take part in the revolution and lost his second eye on the 16th of November in Mohamed Mahmoud. So, and he was one of many, many people who lost eyes, so that became something that was commemorated in the giant graffiti that went up in the street afterwards. And yeah, so this is Mohamed Mahmoud, and this is why it became very important to commemorate it. It led, in fact, to the events of Cabinet Street, where you have the picture which everybody has seen of the young woman being dragged along the street, the young woman in the jeans and the blue bra. That was sort of the continuation of this. So, and another thing that happened in Mohamed Mahmoud was that, I didn't put a picture of this, but was that as the army and the police were beating up people and killing people in the street and in the square, they were also dragging them off, kind of like to tidy them away on the side of the road. And it became a thing of like throwing corpses in the dustbin kind of thing. So, because of Mohamed Mahmoud, the cabinet resigned, and the army actually set a date for elections and set a date for the handover of power. Now, we all know what happened next, of course, and we had the elections, and we ended up with Dr. Mohamed Morsi in power, and the confrontations carried on, and the same system, the same economic, policies, the same power ambitions, the same coercion that we had under SCAF and under Mubarak was continued under Mohamed Morsi. So when November came around again, there was the issue of commemorating Mohamed Mahmoud. That was going to be the first anniversary. This young man, his name is Mohamed Gaber, and he became known as Jika, or he was known as Jika, because he was also a football ultra. He was a student. He was an extremely active and dynamic leader of the high school student groups. And here, I don't know how many people speak Arabic here, but he is holding a placard that says, the constitution of the people for all the people. He was one of the people who, like me, like many of us, in the second round of the presidential elections voted for Dr. Morsi rather than voting for the military candidate or spoiling their ballot and therefore being potentially responsible if the military candidate came in. And so, even though he didn't want to, but he voted for Morsi and he went out and celebrated Morsi's win as being a civilian win and a change win as opposed to stagnation and the military. And here he is in those celebrations with the typical classic sort of ultra leading chants kind of thing. In the commemoration of Mohamed Mahmoud last year, he was killed. I mean, he was one of 3 people who were killed. And this is his banner. One of the traditions that has evolved is, and it's a brilliant invention, is using fishing rods as the flagpoles for the banners of the shuhada, the martyrs. It's got this sort of, it's always black on white. It's sort of ethereal. It's really, really tall, and it's very graceful and flexible in how it moves. It's light. So this is his, and this is his banner. So we come to this year and the issue of the commemoration this year. And now we're really back under military rule again. So we have a caretaker and interim government, but the people who are really in charge are the military. And it's somewhat worse than it was when they were first in power, because when they were first in power, the Ministry of the Interior, the police, the security establishment had been beaten in the streets and was in retreat and was sulking in a corner and was afraid to come out on the streets. Now, what's happening is that the military have brought the security services back under their wing after the 30th of June and are basically facilitating the return of the security state, having learned the lessons that it, I mean, you know, the lessons in how to try to prevent people expressing their wish for change. So we now have a situation where the military are bringing the security state back. The security state is determined that when it comes back, as it has, it will be on its own terms, and it will not be held accountable, and it will not be held accountable for the past either. And we also, and this is probably a powerful reason why they conducted the massacre at Rabaa of the sit-in of the Muslim Brotherhood, because there was a solution on the table which involved starting negotiations, and it had been agreed. Our understanding is that a deal had been agreed, and everybody waited for 2 days for it to be implemented, and then the government didn't implement it, and the decision was taken to go in and to end the sit-in by force, and more than 800 people were killed that day. And it is possible that that was the sort of carte de visite of the Ministry of the Interior, saying to the army, if you want us back and if you want us to do this work for you, then this is how we're going to do it, and we're not going to be held accountable. So here's the situation. And we also have, of course, this tremendous polarization now between supporters of the new old regime of General Sisi and supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood. Probably, if one had to take a guess, the odd poll would say that pro-government about 70%, and pro-Brotherhood or Islamists in general about 20%. And it's probably quite generous to say that the people who hold on to the beliefs and ideals and positions of the revolution, 10% maybe. And of course, they're the ones who are disliked and feared by both sides, because they're the ones who will not take a side and who will insist on saying that they will not have a security state and they will not have the military in power, but also that Morsi and the Brotherhood were really the same old regime but with new faces, and we don't want them either. So we come to how do you commemorate Mohamed Mahmoud? And you can't brush it away. You can't say, well, we're not going to commemorate it, because there has been no justice, there has been no closure, there has been no retribution, and people have friends and have family. And also, for all the revolutionaries, the remaining revolutionaries, this is almost a sacred moment and a sacred trust, and they're not going to not go out into the streets and commemorate it. So while the revolutionaries are having discussions, revolutionary sounds so kind of much, isn't it? It's so over, but I was trying to think of another. In Arabic, it's so much easier because it's thuwar, which is kind of shorter anyway. Anyway, so while we're discussing, and there are many, many discussions, how you can go out and commemorate it while not, or trying to not allow more young people to die on the anniversary, there are announcements from the Muslim Brotherhood that they're going to go out and commemorate. A key thing about November 2011 was that the Islamists stayed away. So when we'd had battles, when there had been battles before, like the 2nd of February, within the 18 days, the Islamists had been there, even though the leadership was not very keen, but the rank and file were there and stood shoulder to shoulder and, you know, fought together, ate together, worked together, and so on. The events of Mohamed Mahmoud, they stayed away. And even though the killing continued for 6 days, they continued to stay away. And while the military and the police were killing revolutionaries in the street, the Brotherhood were holding talks with the military about the elections and trying to do what they generally do, which is arrive at a deal as to the form, or how many seats, who would get in which elections, and so on. And that is why Mohamed Mahmoud is kind of like, it is just the revolution. So, surprise, the Muslim Brotherhood say that they're going to go out and commemorate the martyrs of Mohamed Mahmoud. And then the army says that it's going to go out and commemorate the martyrs of Mohamed Mahmoud. And in fact, General Sisi makes a statement inviting everyone to go out and commemorate the martyrs. So suddenly you've got the people who killed you and the people who abandoned you to be killed coming out to commemorate the event and to appropriate it. So how do you deal with that? If you decide to stay home, now remember that also you're the one that they both don't like. And they are both armed and both violent, and they both want to kill each other, and they both want to kill you. And so if you're out there and there are going to be confrontations, even if you don't confront anything, you are very likely going to be caught in the middle by accident on purpose. So what do you do? Now, you know that the young people are not going to stay home. Jika's friends, the friends of the 50 people who were killed or who had their, and the many more, I think it was 4,000 severely, severely wounded in 2011, they're not going to stay home. So, you know, how can the older people who still are within the revolution and who are going around thinking, you know, how can this be organized? How can we try to protect them? And can we, in fact, try to protect them? So, the decision, finally, was that on the 18th, now, Mohamed Gaber, Jika, his family decided to hold a commemoration for him and his friends on the 18th. In other words, one day before the big thing where everybody was going to go out and where it was going to be very dangerous. And they were going to hold it actually just off in a square at the very end, the other end of Mohamed Mahmoud from Tahrir. So kind of saying, we are going to try and stay out of harm's way. And everybody else said, well, we're going to go out and have an orderly march on the 19th and try not to have people killed. So, okay, this was actually, right. I lost the link, but I wanted to make the point that when the revolution happened, that, yeah, because we were talking about sort of, about tortures and killings in Mubarak's time. And when the revolution happened, it was, the trigger point was the killing of a young man. You will remember Khaled Saeed, I'm sure you'll recognize his picture when you see it, in Alexandria in June 2010. So, and for him also, there had been no retribution yet. And so basically these killings, yes, this was what it was really, that basically the killings of young people and of activists had been going on from Mubarak's time into the revolution with SCAF, into Mohamed Morsi's time, and in fact continue until now. So this was why I was actually just digressing into Khaled Saeed, whom you all know, and he wasn't the only person that, in fact, I think 3 people had been killed in the couple of months preceding his murder, but the difference was his family. That when activists went to the families of the other people, they didn't want to know. They did not want to go public. They did not want to make a fuss. They were afraid. Khaled Saeed's mother and sister were not afraid, and in fact, they facilitated, and this is quite difficult. If you don't want to see the next one, you can close your eyes. They facilitated the picture that was taken of him at the morgue, which then became very powerful in motivating people and moving people on the 25th of January and in all the months before. So Khaled Saeed becomes the first martyr, even though he was killed months before the revolution. His graffiti, instantly recognizable all over the country, becomes the first graffiti of one of the young people killed in the revolution. So, yeah. And okay, going back to Mohamed Mahmoud and that there had been no closure and that this is why it has to be commemorated and so on. The issue is so big and it's so powerful that one of the things that Mohamed Morsi had to do was he had to appoint a commission of investigation into the killings of the young people of the revolution. He fought it, he tried hard to wriggle out of it, but eventually he was forced to put together a fact-finding committee, and they worked for some 6 months, and they put forward a document, many thousands of pages long, and it has been sitting in a drawer ever since. So Dr. Morsi did not make it public. And then, of course, General Sisi did not make it public either, and the current government also seems to have no intention of making it public. So the question of the law when people went out on the 25th of January, I mean, the link is that, that one of the central demands of the revolution since people started getting killed was just retribution, or the concept of qasas, which is a kind of just punishment which carries within it the idea of closure, the idea of the family sort of arriving at some kind of peace. So this insistence on the law and on the idea of law was very much part of the revolution, even though the law had for a long time not actually afforded the citizen, the individual citizen, any protection from the confrontations with power. People somehow continued to believe in it and continued to believe that the failures of the law were to do with its not being implemented properly. So, for example, there were lots of cases that did receive what people would consider a just judgment, but were not acted upon. Very many corruption cases, for example. I mean, there was a lot of resistance to a lot of privatization that was going on as part of course, restructuring and doing what the IMF told you to do and so on. But the deals were corrupt and people took them to court. And there were several judgments where the judgment was that the deal was corrupt and was incorrect and could not go on, and that the company or the factory or whatever had to be handed back to the state, and none of that was acted on. Cases of displacement where people were moved from one location to another against their will, and the court opined that they had a right to remain in their place and was not acted upon. But the general perception was that if the law was properly implemented, it would do what people believe it's there for. And I think one of the most flagrant cases, for example, is in June, this last June, the 2nd of June, 2013, the Constitutional Court ruled on a case in front of it, ruled that even in times of emergency, it was still unlawful to go into people's homes without, to break into people's homes without a warrant, and it was unlawful to hold people beyond a certain amount of time, and it was unlawful to use coercion and so on. So the Constitutional Court ruled this June 2013, but the case had actually been brought before it in April 93. April 1993. It took them 30 years to decide to look at it and to put forward a judgment. So, but when people think that the law isn't being implemented properly, then the question is, who is it being not implemented properly by? And when you follow that line of questioning, then you arrive at the state. And quite soon, you recognize that the state is actually no longer, or I don't know if it ever was, but it is not the representative of the people. It's not the sum total of the community. But essentially, it is, in our case, a collection of individuals who are using their power and their position to enrich themselves and their friends. And they are doing this with varying degrees of criminality. Some of it is sort of above board, but morally not very nice, and some of it is downright criminal. So the revolution, when it came, was not about dismantling the state or exploring novel systems of administration or whatever. I mean, some people, of course, were and continue to talk about that and to believe that we are in a kind of lab, and that in fact the whole world is in a kind of lab where it all needs to work out what the new system that is actually going to keep the planet from being destroyed and so on, and have, you know, and be more equitable for the majority of the people. But on the whole, the majority of the people who went out on the 25th of January and who stayed out until they got rid of Mubarak were not there to destroy or dismantle the state, but they were there to reclaim the state and have a state which is run properly, and have a state which conforms to the rule of law, and where the law is as it is meant to be, where everybody is equal in front of it, and it. So it was wanting a state that did its job, that planned, that provided security, that it was possible to run your life through in return for, of course, you know, the social contract, the taxes that you paid or whatever. And if you unpackage the slogans of the revolution, bread, freedom, social justice, that is really basically what it amounts to, that you want an economic system that works for the majority of the people, that you have human rights, and that you have a restructuring of the distribution of wealth to mitigate the huge gap that, Egypt isn't the only country, but it is in countries like Egypt that you see it at its starkest. So, basically for 40 years, the state machinery had just been used to facilitate the enrichment of a small group of people. And if you look at any aspect of life in Egypt in the last 30 years, and very much so in the last 20, you see a country that is, it's as if it's under occupation. The degree to which the people don't matter, and what matters is a small elite at the top. So choice parts of cities are earmarked for a particular kind of development, and there are huge attempts to push communities out of them, and when communities resist, then people get imprisoned and people get killed. And there's a dream, Gamal Mubarak's dream of Dubai by the Nile, where it's all sort of towers and and it's all sort of rich people. Parceling out land, and this is something that the army was very involved in, because the army controls a lot of the land. So parceling out land and selling it at ridiculous prices, and supplying water to, again, cronies who will build cities, the gated communities. Reclaiming land, actually sort of bits of the river or bits of lake being down, I don't know how you call it, but when you turn the shore, you go into the water and you make all that into a platform, so that then you can build houses on it for, again, the very, very select few. Now, Ahmed Shafiq, who was the military candidate, was very much involved in that particular. Licensing gold mining, for example, a gold mine which there's a company that only exists. It has no other, it's a foreign company, and it has no other job and no other activity in the whole world except mining the gold from one gold mine in Egypt. I mean, the level of exploitation of the land, of the environment, polluting, obviously, a lot of pollution, of when it gets to a point where the son of your president is trading in the foreign debt of the country, for example. So anyway, yeah, the monopoly of steel, the subsidies on energy going to the very rich with their cement factories, and so on and so on. So, because its main aim is to enrich itself, it neglects or even runs down deliberately institutions that can get in the way of money making. So if you want to make money through creating private universities, you run down the national universities. Similarly with hospitals, if you appoint one of the largest owners of private medicine as your Minister of Health, for example, and you allow the hospitals, a poor person going to hospital, even though the doctors want to work, and even though the doctors do absolutely everything that they can, they still have to, for example, buy their own cotton wool and their own antiseptic and their own. So you go into hospital in an emergency and somebody has to go out and buy the stuff that is going to be used to treat you. Even garbage collection, which was running perfectly well on a homegrown, basic, sort of organically recycling system, gets taken away from the people who've done it for hundreds of years and gets given to Spanish and French companies to run it. And the upshot is that you have an army of street sweepers who are actually beggars in the street because they don't get paid, and the garbage piling up. But meanwhile, somebody along the way has made a lot of money in commissions. So this could go on and on and on, but the point is that as things get worse and worse and worse for the ordinary person, because there's no development, there are no serious projects, the education gets run down, there's no healthcare, there's no hope. As things get worse and worse, the need to control that person who is getting more and more unhappy and more angry, the need to control that person becomes stronger, and therefore the state becomes more and more brutal in its dealings with the people. The other thing, of course, is that, not the other thing actually, one more thing is that eventually it's actually like the state, instead of simply being a facilitator for the very rich and powerful and an enforcer, holding down the people so that they can continue to be robbed, it then itself turns into some kind of pickpocket. And so, for example, you get a big project like suddenly they're going to bring in a whole load of black and white, of new white taxis. And anybody who owns and runs an old black and white taxi can trade their taxi in and will be given a loan at good rates to get this new taxi. And, you know, they're going to start afresh and have a new car and so on. And so people do that. But then it turns out, actually, once they've done it, it turns out that they have, the contract that they have signed ties them into doing a service every 3 months in particular garages that belong to part of the elite. And that in those garages, you're fleeced, basically. And you're not allowed to do stuff outside, like change your own oil or whatever. It all has to be done through those garages. So basically, the state has got its hand in your pocket, and the people at the lowest level, even within the system, are left with so little that they are forced to rob their neighbors. So the head of police in Cairo gets a salary of £1 million a month. The policeman on the street dealing with the people gets maybe 700. So he runs a protection racket. The same in education, the same in every area of people's lives. Every organization that comes into contact with the people is like this and needs to be paid off, bribed, and so on. And so, as well as becoming more and more brutal in keeping people down, the state also has to keep outside powers happy, because Egypt is in a very particular position and it needs to remain stable, and etc. So it needs to keep, for example, the United States happy. what that leads you into is it leads you into a certain economic pattern, it leads you into borrowing, it leads you into structural reforms that the people in general object to. It also leads you into particular deals, like selling your gas to Israel for practically less than the cost that it costs you to get it out of the ground, like playing a particular role with regard to Palestine, like an extremely dirty role that Egypt has been playing for years now. And the best one of all, of course, is to become the place of choice for extraordinary rendition. And with the country becoming the torturer for the Americans, I'm sure that when the research is done, it will turn out that the torture the torture of normal people just taken into a police station or into jail in Egypt also rises. So that in the last 5 years or so, it became it became an expected thing that if somebody was taken into custody, they were going to be beaten, tortured, ill-treated, and so on, and that also happened in jails. So I just want to go back now to the revolution to say that this level of criminality on the part of the state is, of course, what brought the revolution about, and that there was, we all heard Silmiya, Silmiya, peaceable, peaceable, and how people, the image of itself that the revolution was presenting was that it was peaceable and it was law-abiding. Now, this is not exactly accurate, but I think that what is accurate is that people acted according to what they believed was right. In other words, when people in the poorer districts, when young men in the poorer districts went and burned police stations, they did not believe that they were committing a crime. They believed that what they were doing was right because they and their friends had been tortured, beaten, ill-treated in those police stations. They burnt down the police stations, but they didn't loot the shops or break, smash up cars, for example. They burnt down the NDP, the National Democratic Party headquarters, Mubarak's extremely hated party headquarters, but right next door to it, there's the Egyptian Museum. And people protected that, made chains, human chains around it, and protected it so that it wouldn't be said that it had been looted at the time of the revolution. So I think that what is more accurate to say is that people acted out their ideas of right and wrong and remained within what they believed was right. So in confrontations with the army, if people got hold of an army officer or a soldier on his own, the wounded were treated, soldiers who broke down were comforted, and again. And so, I think that this idea of knowing right from wrong and acting within right was very, very powerful. And again, and it is connected to the idea of the law. It's important, I think, always to remember that the lead up to the revolution could not have happened, and it could not have remained happening, remained ongoing, without the support of a number of organizations which were working and continue to work at tremendous risk and cost to themselves, which are basically human rights organizations. So some of you will know Aida Saif al-Dawla, of course, the Nadim Center for the Support of Victims of Torture. Monamina, Doctors Without Rights. Layla Soueif, Freedom of the Academy and of the Universities. Mahinur al-Masri, lawyer, carrying out the defense of a lot of the activists who get detained in Alexandria particularly. Raja Umran, again, one of the founders of the Front for the Defense of, the legal defense of the protesters. These are the people who really, don't know how they do it, have been working non-stop for about 13 years and who are always there at the front. And it is interesting that the extent of the input of the legal NGOs and the lawyers. There are lots of men as well. I just couldn't quickly find any pictures of them. And the thing that the revolution also has done is that in the absence of the state, groups have formed that have really taken on functions that normally, that they wouldn't normally have to. And these groups continue. Again, this is part of why I say an ongoing revolution, because they were born, some of them were born before the revolution, some of them were born with it, and they continue working until now. This group, حنلاقيهم, these are the people who look for the missing. A lot of people have gone missing during the revolution. From time to time, you learn that in the morgue there are 80 bodies that nobody has claimed. And all the time, there are families, parents who are looking for somebody who went out to Tahrir or went out to anywhere or went to work or went in the subway and just never came back. So this group, حنلاقيهم, looks for them. This group, وطن بلا تعذيب, a country without torture, and they have actually just scored a very important victory in that with the constitution which is now being written, they actually managed to get not only prohibits torture, but actually describes it better than in the past. In the past, well, it continues to be the case, but torture, physical abuse or whatever, abuse of any kind, was only torture if it was to elicit information. So if somebody was taken into custody and just beaten up for the hell of it, then that wasn't torture. And so now, the article that they have managed to put into the draft of the Constitution says that torture is what is described as torture by, I think it's the United Nations, but it's the generally agreed definition of torture. Okay, and these are the no to military trials, no to court-martialing civilians, people. Again, they have been incredibly important. We've had about 16,000 civilians court-martialed since the revolution began. And this is, again, something that is being fought over in the Constitution now. And we don't believe that the military are going to allow an article that prohibits the court-martialing of civilians. It's probably going to, it is actually probably going to be put in the Constitution that you cannot court-martial civilians except in the following cases, and that's going to constitutionalize it, which means that we're going to have to go back and rewrite the Constitution again one day. And this is Manifesto Shab, which are general. So, to go back to Tahrir Square, this is where I'm going to end, to Mohamed Mahmoud, that these young people, and there are many, many more, there are people working on agricultural issues, on water, on the right to shelter and housing, on what's happening with the antiquities, what's happening with the material heritage, ground level work, which is totally voluntary, totally unfunded, and just undertaken with a level of passion and commitment that is brilliant, brilliant to see. So, to go back to the street, in order to end there. Yeah. yes, what I was going to say was that when SCAF came to power, it took advantage of this tremendous hunger for rightness and for correctness, and it immediately plunged the country into a whole lot of legalistic procedures, which really were a red herring and really actually sucked a lot of breath out of the revolution. So SCAF came to power and said, okay, you want elections, and of course you have to have a new constitution, which we didn't have to have, really. We could have lived perfectly well with the 1971 constitution, removing the amendments that Mubarak put to it. But anyway, so you have to have a new constitution and you have to have elections. Which would you like first? And how will we decide which you would like first? Let's have a referendum. So here we go, and that was the first exercise in the ballot box for people. That was March 2011, and it was met with tremendous happiness. At last, people were going to go and vote, and their votes were actually going to be counted. And there was a more than 80% turnout. One after another, these exercises, the election of parliament, further referendums, election of the president, bit by bit people came to see that actually they didn't matter. Actually, they didn't change anything that was happening on the ground. And so the last one, which was the election of the president, you had something like 25% turnout. And that is the disillusionment that was being put in place, and where the revolution was about empowerment, and where at a certain level, as I said at the very beginning, people do feel empowered and do feel that they can change things if they want. What is constantly being pushed back at them is, no, whatever you do, things can't and won't change. And this is the argument, the dialectic that continues. So, to sum up, since the 11th of February, we have had SCAF, the Muslim Brotherhood, and now the interim government, security state, and every one of them have proved that really they don't have any intention of steering the country towards human rights or a more just economy or any of the aims of the revolution. But every one of them has also adopted the language of the revolution as a camouflage so you talk, and meanwhile you try to arrange the structures of power to continue the same system of exploitation that was there, but with different faces. And so, of course, while they've been doing this, it has continued to be necessary for them to kill people. Figures, but so, and now, of course, to go back, the attempt is that they sort of holding the fort, but really to make the law do what they wanted to do. So if detaining people isn't legal, then let's institute a law that does make it legal. So we have the battle over the articles of the Constitution happening, but at the same time, and at the very beginning when I said we have exceptional things happening right now, there are attempts to push through an anti-terror law, a law that organizes, but really outlaws protest, a law to do with the right to unionize, and a law that governs the behavior of NGOs, what they can do, where they can get their funding, who controls them, and so on. And all these, so on the one hand, they're trying to put certain things into the Constitution. On the other hand, they're trying to push laws in before the Constitution comes into being that will allow them more control of the country. The resistance to all this, of course, is what is happening with the ongoing revolution, is the street action, all the groups that I showed you, all the NGOs, the legal NGOs, the support NGOs that are working. And, of course, the street. And things like the commemoration of Mohamed Mahmoud, which was just these last 3 days. So to go back to the street, now, remember I said that the Muslim Brotherhood said that they were going to go out and celebrate, and the army said that everybody should go out and celebrate. So suddenly on the, on the 16th, now the commemoration is supposed to be the 19th, and GCA's family have said that they will do the 18th as well. On the 16th, a structure goes up in the middle of Tahrir Square, like that. And word is that this is a memorial, or the beginnings of a memorial, to the martyrs of the revolution. There's been no consultation, there's been no announcement, there's been nothing. There's just been a pile of bricks that the government runs in and puts together with a plinth in the middle, you can see it there, and with a kind of word going around that this is going to become a monument to the martyrs of the martyrs of the revolution, being the people, the young people, the revolutionaries who were killed, plus any member of the police who was killed at any point, and also the army. And they also built a tent, which is obviously going to be for the dignitaries who are going to open or inaugurate or whatever, announce something to do with this pile of bricks. Meanwhile, down the street in Mohamed Mahmoud, the revolutionaries are preparing, doing their own preparations. So we're back to graffiti, to huge murals. You can see there's a young woman here on the ladder. Here she is. Oh, sorry, and a young man on the other one. And lots of those huge murals. And then the event happens, the GCA's family event in Abdeen Square happens on the 18th. Oh, sorry. Okay. I'm going to try and do something. I'm not sure if it's going to work, but what I want to do is I want to show you something and then stop it. So what you're going to see is the inauguration, which happened on the 18th in the morning. Again, suddenly, it was like the government was undertaking a commando operation, a stealth operation. They run in and build this strange thing and put some tents there, and then they run in and inaugurate it, and then they sort of run away again. So here it is with all the paraphernalia of the state. Okay? So, sorry, this is, Actually, I think I'm supposed to be, no, I lost something. Anyway, what I was getting at was that here was the revolutionary stuff, and here again is the revolutionary stuff, and then here is the state, and then again this is now the 19th. No, let me do this. So sorry, just off the plane. Okay. Yeah. This one here. This is the GCA family thing on the 18th. When that's over, instead of going home, some kids go out into Tahrir, and now let's watch the rest of the Okay, this says 12 hours later. Now, if you don't understand Arabic, okay, so kursi is the seat, which is the presidency or the seat of power, and then there's a really, really terrible insult, and it's Sisi and Morsi. Okay, so it's sort of like that. Now, they've painted it with, oh, what am I doing? I hate myself. I'll just talk over it very quickly. You get to hear the insult 3 times. Musarreen are a film collective which are doing what the media doesn't do, which is record everything. The plaque, the memorial plaque that was on the plinth, actually, again, in another beautiful example of the sensitivity and connectedness of the powers that be, it has President Adli Mansour's name in very, very big, and then Prime Minister Biblawi's name in quite, quite big, and then a third name I can't remember, maybe I don't know who it is, and then in little it says, "For the Martyrs of the Revolution." So they plastered all their stuff over it, and those that banner read "A revolutionary space prohibited to military, to fulul, i.e. the remnants of the Mubarak regime, and to the Ikhwan, the Brotherhood. So that was the 18th that happened. Next day was the sort of standard march, which was called by the other revolutionary forces. It begins like this, and it goes on here. And you can see at one end of Mohamed Mahmoud Street all these pictures of the martyrs. And by the end of the day, this is what has happened to the thing that the government has put there. It has been dismantled. It has been, it's got a coffin on it covered with the flag. It's got the Vendetta mask. And it's got a sign, Ma'am Sidi Biblawi, which is the shrine of Saint Biblawi, who is the current prime minister. And so this is now the shrine of Saint Biblawi. And finally, though, the conflict does happen between the police and the young people. This young man, his name is Ronnie. He was a very close friend of Gaber Salah, Jika. And this picture is of him at the funeral of his friend. And in fact, last night, he was very badly wounded. So after the marches and after the redesign of the monument, again, there was conflict, and again, there was shooting. I haven't seen the news today, but until this morning, there were 2 young men who had died. This one has had shots in both hands, and there are 3 others in critical condition, and another 15 who are just wounded. And the question, of course, then, ultimately, I guess the question is, if your weapons are decorating a monument and letting off fireworks and chanting and trying to take on the job of the state in the streets and with the people, can you ultimately win if you don't have guns and if you don't respond to violence with violence or initiate violence of your own? And that is the question, of course, that is constantly being asked. But there's no doubting that so far, the general spirit of the ongoing revolution is to continue to be non-violent, except when provoked and in self-defense. So, I think I've probably gone way over time. But thank you. And
well, thank you, Ahdaf. And I think
this is very, very kind.
I think it's not often in a university setting that we are exposed not just to the bravery of the people that Ahdaf talked about, but the bravery of the speaker herself. And I think that it's an enormous privilege for us, Ahdaf, to be in your presence and to hear your insights into the revolution itself and into the continuity of repression, which you talk so beautifully about. I mean, everyone can talk beautifully about repression. But I think that we have learned a great deal, and I think that we should be utterly inspired by you and by the young people that you've talked about. And I hope that in some way, those of us here who care can help the revolutionary cause in Egypt, and certainly at the International State Crime Initiative. We will do what we can, continue to publish the Mossering Collective's work, which I think is tremendous. And hopefully we'll have you writing for us too. It was a marvelous talk. Thank you so much. I now want to open the floor for questions and contributions. If you have any, I would expect that there would be some. I'm going to start here at the back. There's a roving mic, so if you could.
Hi, I just wanted to ask a question about the huge street movement and how that's developed since June the 30th, because I was in Cairo in the summer, and it's very different what that street movement looks like to what it did on January 25th. And it is not necessarily made up of the same young people who went out on January 25th, and the street has always been the kind of preserve of that movement. So how can revolutionaries now interact with this new street movement that is very big, is very diverse? Because to me it seems that the revolutions of January 25th are almost paralysed now. Well, they were certainly when the army was battling with the Muslim Brotherhood, because you were looking at two counter-revolutionary forces fighting each other, with the revolution kind of in a state of paralysis. So what role can those revolutionaries play now in relating to this new big wave of street protests that is very much saying, you know, we are revolutionaries, but it might not be explicitly demanding the things that the revolutionaries of the January 25th did?
Sure, thank you. The thing is that the 30th of June, that was a huge street movement, and it was, if you like, the third wave of the revolution. But it doesn't continue as a street movement. I mean, the people who went out on the 30th of June, then, most of them, then handed over to the army and went home. And so now they support the army, but they're not out there doing things. So it isn't a street movement. Do you see what I'm saying? So whatever movement there is on the street is really either the protests of the Brotherhood, which are still happening, and are very often loci for violence and so on, or they are the revolution. The issue, of course, I mean, there are several issues. One is that this is the first time that the revolution isn't popular. In other words, if you go out on the street now and sort of start talking about social justice, you could get beaten up, because people are so fed up, and people are so tired, and people are so disillusioned, and they really, really, really hope that the army and a strong, government is going to give them what they want. It won't, and eventually it'll all have to happen again. But at the moment, this is what they want, and it's like, what have we gotten from, all your talk of whatever? We got the Brotherhood, and they turned out to be, and now, okay, we have this situation that we like and that we're going to support, and so on. So that is a very unpleasant situation, feeling, sense. And the other unpleasant one, of course, is that you've really learned the final lesson that you're not going to work with the Brotherhood or with the Islamist current, that all that talk about sort of everybody wants change, but maybe we want different change, and you know, let's try and work together and so on, that's over. But at the same time, as a revolutionary, you can't stand by and see them being killed or not object to the discourse about getting rid of them. So you want to stand up for their rights, but at the same time, you don't want that standing up hijacked by them into support for them as a political movement. And that is very, very difficult. But that is what the revolution has to negotiate now, and that is what, like, is being done in those slogans and banners and so on, but it needs to be done every time anybody speaks or, you know, takes a position on anything and so on. And the constant accusation is either that you are a sleeping Islamist cell, or that you are a supporter of the army, or that you are the fifth column. I mean, one of our chants yesterday was, we're the fifth column, because that's sort of, you know, and ridiculous stuff like you're the link between international Islamism and communism. What does that even mean? I mean, you know, it's sort of stuff that is still garbled, but it just sort of is going around like that. So at the moment, really, the revolution, the answer is that at the moment, the discourse is very difficult, but people are undertaking it. And that the main thing is the continued action on the ground, and the trying to learn from what we didn't manage before, which is to try and establish contact, roots, you know, common cause, and try and present a vision, not just of what we don't want, but of what we do want, in a way that attracts people. And all without funding and while you're being shot at. Oh, there we are.
Thank you very much, Ahdaf, and I would join Penny in thanking you really from having come straight from Tahrir. You know, we don't get these live, engaged reports on Newsnight. I mean, this is something very special. Thank you very much for that. I just wanted to make one very brief comment and then get to a question. I do believe that the events of the Egyptian revolution have been some of the most important of our lifetime. I mean, I've been very, very lucky, very privileged to have participated in some of those events, including the events in the streets that Ahdaf described. And it is a lifetime political experience because, above all, of the sense of self-realization and collective power and confidence which ordinary people demonstrate. And this is really it's a global lesson for us, I think. The question I wanted to ask is as follows, that one very interesting aspect of the mass movement has been that it created the space to challenge the authority of the Mubarak regime and then of the army. It challenged the legitimacy of those forces.
Sorry,
and
which movement?
the legitimacy.
No, at the very beginning of that.
I said that the movement created the space to challenge the authority of the old Mubarak state and of the armed forces. And I know something that the International State Crime Initiative is very concerned about, is very interested in, is the way in which alternative definitions and understandings of legitimacy arrive from mass movements. And I was very struck on many visits in Cairo that one of the main slogans of the movement in relation to Mubarak and then to the army was to challenge the legitimacy by challenging the notion, raising the notion of batil, of illegitimacy. And that the question of cleansing, tathir, of getting rid of the bad old stuff, has been very, very central. So my precise question is, to what extent has the movement been able to maintain the momentum of the idea of a type of new form of justice? So rather than the old illegitimacy, creating new forms of legitimacy. And in similar movements worldwide, we've sometimes seen movements for so-called transitional justice, in which various sorts of collectives emerge, which develop their own moral codes, and perhaps I'm not a lawyer, but in some sense their own legal reference points. And I wonder if at this point in the revolution, there's still the momentum for that sort of agenda.
Yeah, well, well, I suppose, again, people know what they don't want. And so the idea of batil, of illegitimate, yeah? So SCAF became illegitimate the moment it shed blood on the streets. Morsi became illegitimate actually when he announced his first constitutional decree, and then even more when he shed blood on the streets, and so on. So the notion of illegitimacy is very clear. Transitional justice was very much something that was spoken about. And then again, it has been, I would say, hijacked, because when the government speaks about transitional justice, it's not possible to see that happening now while the people in power are the people who committed the crimes. So, you know, you can't really, I mean, if you went through some kind of process now, it would be it would be empty. It would be a shell. It would not mean anything. But I don't know that anybody is. Again, I think that it's assumed that legitimacy is the default position, and that what you need to point out is illegitimacy all the time. I hope this answers your question. It's a very academic question, and I'm not an academic. Yes. Sorry.
Most revolutions, like French Revolution, have been soaked in blood as they go along. But as people sort of develop into them, the vast majority of people actually just want stability, and they will actually settle for a lot less than rights and everything sort of fall away, because all they want to do is know that they're going to have meals at the end of the day, their kids are not going to be killed, they're going to be educated. Which way do you think Egypt is going to go with that? Do you think they're going to sort of, with potential elections coming soon, do you think they are going to go for whoever offers stability, or they're still going to try and push for revolution?
Okay, you're completely right, and I think in fact that the stage that we're in now is exactly what you described, that people are tired, that people believe that this setup with with the army and the police and so on is going to guarantee them what they want. And I mean, most people can't be revolutionaries all the time. For a start, there's the question of earning a living, you know, and it's temperament as well, and so on. And so I think we're at the stage where people would go for stability, and they will go for stability until they discover what stability looks like. Again, Mahmoud, this was one of the things, one of the cliches, the watchwords of the Mubarak regime. Let's have stability, and the SCAF immediately after, until, you know, bit by bit, the notion of interrogating what stability looks like became current. Now we're back again into the same situation. I also don't know, when you talk about whether they would vote for stability or vote for the revolution, I actually don't really know what's going to happen in elections, because I don't quite see how the revolution is going to field candidates. I mean, obviously, we're going to try, and obviously this is one of the things that we're all, you know, not all, but a section is working on. But ultimately, if it fields candidates, they will be few, and we will be very happy if some of them get in, so that at least you have a presence in Parliament that questions what is going on, or that puts awkward issues, or that proposes laws or whatever. But I think that the majority of people right now would vote for stability, but it's not going to last. The Brotherhood are not going to be voted in by, I mean, the people who vote for the Brotherhood, if they run, I mean, they say they won't run, and then they say they will, and the government says they can run, and then the government says they're going to disband them and they can't run, so nobody knows. But were they to run tomorrow, nobody would vote for them except their members. They are truly, truly, it's over.
Hi, over here, up here. Thank you for this priceless lecture today, first of all. I have two questions for you. I'm from City University. My name is Hassan. My first question is, I'll quote you first. You said people think they can change everything if they feel empowered. And then you say about the memorial thing government was making, that it was kind of a stealth operation. And then next, after 12 hours, you show how people, take over the memorial and come out again. Looking at the situation today, what Egypt is in the state, don't you think empowering people too much, although I'm a pro-democracy supporter as well, but then again, 1 million people came out in England against the Iraq protest. They didn't topple the government, There's a process, people need to learn. There's a way in case of, it's not a dictatorship. When it's a democracy, when there is an election after 4 or 5 years, then there's obviously a channel. When there's a parliament, there's a way. So obviously, it left a very wrong message. Actually, if the people of pro-democracy were demoralized, because if democracies are toppled like this overnight, don't you think it's wrong by the people who came out? They should have realized what they were doing is something not right. And this is my first question. And my second question is...
let me just ask you something. When they came out, you mean when they toppled Morsi?
Yeah, Morsi, the second time. Okay. The second time. Do you want me to ask the second?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
And my second question is, I think we were looking at quite, not at a broader level, the whole thing, because I've been part of a movement, something similar to this in Pakistan, which was the very famous lawyers movement, yes, where thousands of people came out, and 4 to 5 years ago. And it took a couple of years to, get to the goal. And today, the goal was to reinstate this Chief Justice. And today, whole people of Pakistan, there's a popular sentiment which believe that it was a total fraud. They were basically, that Chief Justice wasn't what they were thinking. So my question over here is, the Egypt, geographical location, there's a Suez Canal, there's a gateway to Gaza, one of the strongest armies of Africa. The Israel is their neighbor. Don't you think there was an external involvement as well as in this whole process? And you yourself said stopping of external funding in the NGOs. And then there's obviously, it's easy to exploit this thing because there's a left and there's a right wing. There's what we label them as Islamists, then there are these seculars. Don't you think it's easy to create the divide by supporting, by external forces supporting these? And don't you think the second time there was this involvement of the external forces when they toppled the democracy? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, this is an important question. It keeps coming up. Do you want me to answer it, or do you want me to take several in one go because of time?
Let's take, how many more questions are there?
Okay, we're done.
There appear
We're
to
done.
be no more questions,
No
and
more.
we'll continue in the reception. So I
Okay.
think answer this question, and then we'll break.
Okay, right. Okay, so really, your issue was toppling Morsi a good move, and toppling a democratically elected leader, and also was there a role that external forces played in this? Okay, there wasn't. Sorry, yeah. Right. I don't think the Americans wanted Morsi got rid of. I think the Americans knew what they were dealing with. They have been talking to the Brotherhood for years, and it actually fits their world vision that if Arab countries get democracy, they will elect Islamist governments, and they've been getting ready for that, and it serves them in a variety of ways. So I don't believe at all that the Americans were involved or wanted to see Morsi toppled. They actually fought it. They kept on sort of, wanting to call what happened a coup, and so on. So there was no intervention of that kind, I don't believe. Was it right to do it? Okay. Basically, we're in a state of revolution. We're not in a stable state where you have a properly democratically elected government and then a rabble goes out and gets rid of it. You need to remember the circumstances of Morsi's election. I'm just going to go into this into a little bit of detail, but I'll talk quick. That when we had the presidential elections, we had the results of the first round were that Morsi got almost 5 million. And Shafiq, the military and old regime man, got almost 5 million. And then all the candidates that were counted on the revolution got about 11 million. But it didn't count because they were scattered, okay? So you ended up, so Hamdin Sabahi, for example, who was a revolutionary candidate, although I think he's not revolutionary anymore, got 4-point-something million. But basically you had the runoff between Morsi and Shafiq because the revolution was fragmented. So that's the first thing to note. And so they both went around making lots and lots of promises about being inclusive, in Morsi's case, about being inclusive, about being a president for all Egyptians, not just for the Brotherhood, about having a deputy who was a Christian and another deputy who was a woman, about seeing just retribution done for the martyrs, about social justice, everything. And so he got an extra 8 million votes. Mine was one of them. These 8 million people didn't want him and didn't want his project. Remember that. But they voted for him because they couldn't bear to vote for the other guy or to see the other guy come in. The other guy also got about 8 million. And they were also people who didn't particularly want him, but were so afraid of Morsi and of the Islamist project that they went that way. So if you were coming in then on the back of a revolution, under these circumstances, then it would have to be your job to pull the country together. And it wasn't for him. And what he did was he went back on every promise he had made. He turned his back on the people and on the revolution. He made friends with the police. He raised their salaries. He said that the police were at the heart of the revolution, and the 25th of January would go back to being Police Day and Revolution Day together. He ran off to the IMF to borrow money when the country was definitely not wanting to borrow any more money from the IMF, and when the Brotherhood had spent 40 years telling us that borrowing from the IMF was usury. But now no circumstances had changed. When, under his command, the police killed protesters in Port Said, I can't remember how many they killed, 30, 40, and then shot at the funeral and killed more people, he came out and in a speech said that what was the problem of losing a few people if it put the country on the right track, and so on and so on. We could count, when the police eventually refused to do his bidding, because they thought he was driving the country into a wall, he then brought down the Muslim Brotherhood militias to deal with the protesters themselves, and so we have people killed by Brotherhood militias. So, given all this, and given that the country is continuing to be in a state of revolution, and given that the constitution that the Brotherhood passed does not have a mechanism for impeaching or getting rid of a president, the people went out and got rid of him themselves. The sad thing is that the army saw the opportunity and played it right this time, and came out and hijacked that real movement, and offered itself as the lazy person's alternative to stability. And this is why we are where we are now. So it, I think, is a profoundly democratic act to have gotten rid of him in that way. And I wish the army hadn't hijacked it.
Well, thank you. And before I say my final thanks to Ahdaf, I want to say a thank you to the Dixon Poon School of Law for funding this event, and a particular set of thanks to those who made the evening possible: Alicia Delacour, Fatima Kanji, Gemma Noyce, and Elizabeth Brain. Thanks very much to you all for your assistance tonight, and it was a fabulous evening. Ahdaf, we're so grateful to you coming. Thank you so much. And now I welcome you all through this door into the Anatomy Museum, where they did once used to perform dissections. We've had a dissection of the Egyptian Revolution. We can now have some wine and some food. Thank you all for coming.